Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of the Dungeon Learner's Guide. Today we have episode 6 of the Commander's Guild Deck Tech series, and this one is titled Get Charbelched, which might, again, give you some ideas for what we're doing, but what we're doing is we are randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com. We're working with a budget of less than $100 and building a commander deck that is designed around the theme of the chosen card. This week, our random card was Vastwood Fortifications, which is a Modal Dual Faced Card. So the back of this card is actually Vastwood Thicket, which is a land that taps for a green mana, and the front side puts a +1/+1 counter on target creature. So when we first got this card, I was a little bit confused about what to do with it. We could have done stuff that involved counters, we could have done some ramp, but in the end, we decided to go with the Modal Dual Faced aspect of the card, and we are playing a deck this week that has 0 lands in it whatsoever. Every single land and mana source that we are using is coming from either the Double Faced cards that have lands on the back, or their mana rocks, cards that we can cast that give us some extra mana. Now, to do that, the commander that we had to go with had to be 5 colors, so we went with Tazri, Beacon of Unity, for a couple of reasons. First, I went with Tazri, if I'm perfectly honest, because she's pretty cheap. She's only 48 cents, so it would have been easier to fit some other cards in the deck as opposed to some of the other 5-color commanders. And her ability, while not super relevant, could still be useful. A lot of the double-faced cards actually wind up being clerics, rogues, warriors, and wizards, not so much allies, but she kind of helps us dig for some of our lands if we need them. Otherwise, for this deck, we had a couple of major themes. The first one is Goblin Charbelcher. This is the namesake of our deck, and what Goblin Charbelcher does is it's an artifact for 4 mana, and you can pay 3, tap it, and reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a land card. And then Goblin Charbelcher deals damage equal to the number of non-land cards revealed this way to target creature or player. If we were to reveal a mountain, it would deal double that damage instead. We have no mountains. And then we put the revealed cards on the bottom of our library in any order. So what this basically does is we reveal cards from the top of our deck until we hit a land. We don't have any lands. And so say we reveal 80 cards, and then we get to do 80 damage to any creature or any player, essentially just killing one of our opponents outright. And the last line of text on this is also pretty important because it says put the revealed cards on the bottom of your library in any order, which means that we basically get to stack our deck entirely once this goes off. We can put whatever we want on top, whatever we want on bottom, and we're able to hopefully repeat this same process the next turn and just keep taking our opponents out one by one. Obviously, that's not the only theme. The next one that we're going to work on is ways to prevent us from getting attacked, or ways to focus our opponent's attention somewhere else. The example I put on here is Pramacon's Sky Rampart. It's a 1/5 wall with flying and defender, and when it enters the battlefield you choose left or right, and each player may attack only the nearest opponent in the chosen direction and planeswalkers controlled by that opponent. So if we don't want to get attacked, we just make sure that whichever opponent to our left or to our right that could attack us is maybe playing a not-so-creature-heavy deck, try to find ways to get around the fact that we are going to be moving pretty slow. All of our lands are coming in tapped. We don't exactly have a lot of high-powered creatures, so we want to try to stay alive as long as possible. The last theme is to be able to get our Charbelcher out there as quickly as possible. We need to ramp. And because all of our lands come in tapped, and they only give us 1 color of mana for the most part, it's very difficult for us to get all of our 5-color shenanigans going and find the things that we need. So using things like Dark Ritual to be able to make a ton of mana on 1 turn leaves us from, playing our cards a turn or 2 later than we normally would, to playing it either on curve or even slightly ahead of curve, depending on what we may have. Beyond our themes, though, we do have a couple of key cards in the deck that are going to be relevant. The first one is Abundance, which again sounds a little bit strange because it says if you would draw a card You may instead choose land or non-land and reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a card of the chosen kind. Put that card into your hand and all others on the bottom. Which, just like Goblin Charbelcher, this specifically says put those cards on the bottom in any order. Abundance gets to come down and activate a little bit earlier than Charbelcher, so we get to activate this the turn after we play it. Typically, our opponents won't see this as a threat. They won't see why this is an issue until after it's done its thing. And once we've drawn a card, we get to stack our entire deck. We can put Charbelcher right on top. We can put some ramp right on top. Whatever we need to get going, we can set that up. The next card is Whir of Invention. If we're looking at Goblin Charbelcher as our main win condition, it's not our only win condition, but it's definitely our key one. We need a way to be able to get that artifact on the board, preferably at instant speed. So Whir of Invention allows us to search our library for an artifact card with converted mana cost X or less, and put it onto the battlefield and shuffle our library. But it is an instant, so we can do this at the end of our opponent's turn, untap, and hopefully immediately kill someone right away with no lands in our deck. The third key card is Sanctum of All. We don't have a super strong enchantment subtheme, but we do have a shrine subtheme. A lot of the sanctums are going to give us a lot of value. So whether they're drawing us cards, or they're draining life from our opponents, or they're tapping our opponent's creatures down, they're able to keep us alive long enough for the rest of our strategy to come into play. And Sanctum of All lets us search for any other shrine, put it onto the battlefield, and if we ever are able to have 6 or more on the battlefield, then all those abilities would trigger twice. So definitely not going to be a win condition, but it's a way to survive until we can hit our main win condition. The other thing that I noticed going through this deck is that there were a couple of cool interactions that showed up while I was putting it together and playtesting it. The first one is the combination of Laboratory Maniac and Undercity Informer. Now, in a non-budget build, we would definitely want to replace Laboratory Maniac with Thassa's Oracle, but because we have to stick to our budget of less than $100, we had to put in Laboratory Maniac instead. But what that card says is if you would draw a card while your library has no cards in it, you win the game. Undercity Informer says that you can pay 1 mana, sacrifice a creature, and target player, that would be us, reveals cards from the top of their library until they reveal a land card, and then puts those cards into their graveyard. So we put our entire library into our graveyard for 1 mana. And if we have any way on board to draw a card, we can just win right there with Laboratory Maniac and Undercity Informer. The second cool interaction is between Goblin Charbelcher, which is again our main win condition, and Ironcrag Feat. Ironcrag Feat is 4 mana that gives us 7 mana, but it only allows us to cast 1 more spell this turn. The neat thing is that Goblin Charbelcher costs 4 to play and 3 to activate, which is exactly 7 mana. So if we can cast Ironcrag Feat with a Charbelcher in our hand, we can immediately cast it and immediately activate it because we would still only be casting 1 card that turn. The activation wouldn't count. So it's a nice sneak attack. It's a nice way to get in some damage and maybe even just knock someone out right away. So overall, with our budget being less than $100, we came very close to our budget range. We were $97.42. And our most expensive card in the deck was Underworld Breach at $7.72, which this deck could very easily do without Underworld Breach. It's in there mainly to protect us in case we use something like our Undercity Informant, we mill out our entire graveyard, or we accidentally mill over our Goblin Charbelcher, we mill over the Sanctum of All, something that we know we need for the future. We're able to rebuy it with Underworld Breach. So you don't necessarily need it, it's just in there for some additional protection, but if you wanted to knock, $7 off the price tag, this could be the card that you cut. But overall, it seems like a fun deck, and what we're going to do is we are going to jump into a game, try to play against some opponents. We have Turgrid, God of Fright, who is piloted by Will. We have Tazri, the Golden Fang, piloted by Manny, and Mael, the Anima, piloted by Mike. So I know that Turgid can be a very quick deck, a very powerful deck. The fact that we are moving slow is a bit of a concern there. The Tazri deck that Manny plays, I know, is a very heavy control deck. It's all about surviving and then outvaluing his opponents. And Mael, I have never played against Mike's Mael deck, but I'm going to assume that it does what Mael does, and it puts big creatures into play very quickly. So I don't think this is going to be a poor game for us. I think we're going to do all right. But I do think our tap lands and moving a little bit slow might hurt us in the long run if we can't find some ramp early on. But we'll jump into that game. Hopefully it goes well. And I hope you guys enjoy it, and I'll talk to you after the game. So at the start of the game, Will goes first, followed by me, Manny, and Mike. On Will's first turn, he plays a swamp, and then casts Sensei's Divining Top. On my turn, I play Black Bloom Bog. Manny plays a Zagoth Triome. Mike plays a Grasslands. Will then plays another swamp. I play a Sajiri Glacier. Manny plays a Murkwater Pathway and then casts Farseek, putting a Watery Grave into play. Mike plays a Windswept Heath, and at his end step, Will activates Sensei's Divining Top, looking at the top 3 cards, and in response to that, Mike cracks both of his fetch lands, getting a pair of shock lands into play. On Will's turn, he plays a swamp and then casts Arcane Signet as well as Demonic Tutor, putting a card to hand. On my turn, I play a Makindi Mesa, and then I cast a Rakdos Signet. Manny plays a Thornwood Falls, gaining a life, casts a Spore Frog, and then he casts Dowsing Dagger, giving the 2 plant tokens to me. Mike plays a Homeward Path, and then casts Rhythm of the Wilds. Will plays a Castle Lochthwain and casts his commander, Turgid. On my turn, I play a Jwari Ruins, cast Orzhov's Signet, and then cast Profane Procession. Manny plays an island, equips the Spore Frog with Dowsing Dagger, and attacks Mike for 3, transforming the Dowsing Dagger. In his second main phase, he casts Death Sprout, destroying Turgid and putting an island into play. Mike plays a forest, casts Domri Raid, and activates his +1, revealing a Seedborn Muse and putting it into his hand. On Will's turn, he casts Oppression and passes. On my turn, I cast a Sphinx Summoner, discarding a card to Oppression, and then searching my library for a Golden Guardian and putting it into my hand. As a side note, at this point, Will loses his internet connection, so we unfortunately have to continue with only 3 players. On Manny's turn, he casts Leyline of Anticipation, and then he moves to attack Domri Raid for 1 with Spore Frog. On Mike's turn, he plays a Mosswort Bridge, and then casts his commander, Mael. And he chooses to put a +1/+1 counter on her with Rhythm of the Wild. He then activates Domri's +1 ability, revealing Platinum Empyrean and putting it to hand. On my turn, I cast the Golden Guardian, and then I attack Domri for 3 with the Sphinx Summoner. In my end step, Manny casts Talent of the Telepath, which mills me for 7 and allows him to cast any instants and sorceries from among them, and since he has Spell Mastery, he gets to choose 2 of those instants and sorceries to cast. Out of the cards revealed, he casts an Undo Inversion, destroying all non-land permanents, and casts Factor Fiction. In response to the Ondu inversion, I activate my Golden Guardian, having it fight my Sphinx Summoner and turning it into a land when it dies. With the Factor Fiction, Mike splits the two piles, and Manny puts a Lull, Search for Azcanta, and Mystic Snake to hand, while putting a Temple of Deceit and Villainous Wealth into the graveyard. On Manny's turn, he then casts Eternal Witness and returns Villainous Wealth to his hand before casting his Search for Azcanta. On Mike's turn, he plays a Plains, and then casts Seedborn Muse, but in response, Manny counters it with a Mystic Snake. On my turn, I cast Conqueror's Galleon and pass. Manny, in his upkeep, uses Search for Azcanta to put Crux of Fate into the graveyard and transforms it into a land. He then casts his commander, Tazri. And moving to combat, he attacks both Mike and I for 2 damage each. Mike plays a Skarg the Rage Pits, and then casts Wrath of God, destroying all creatures. In response, Manny activates Tazri, targeting me with his ability, and I have him put a Lull into his hand. After that, the Wrath of God resolves. And in his second main phase, Mike casts a Selvala Heart of the Wilds. On my turn, I activate Goldforge Guardian to make a 4/4 Golem, drawing a card with Selvala's ability, and I use it to crew the Conqueror's Galleon and attack Mike for 2. He blocks with Selvala, doing no damage to either player, and at the end of combat, I transform the Galleon into a land. In response to the transformation, Manny activates Azcanta and puts a Season's Pass to hand, and I then play a Kazandu Valley and pass. Manny casts a Seedborn Muse, cycles Lull, plays a Forest, and then recasts Tazri. He then casts Deadly Rollick for free, exiling Selvala. In Mike's untap step, Manny also gets to untap all of his permanents, thanks to Seedborn Muse. Mike then plays a Sacred Foundry untapped, and casts Dragonlord Dramoka. At the end of turn, Manny activates Drownyard Temple, returning it to the battlefield, and then he also activates Tazri's ability. He again targets me, and I have him put the Deadly Rollick back into his hand, with the promise that he doesn't use it on any of my things. He then also activates Azcanta, and winds up putting a Journey to Eternity into his hand. On my turn, Manny and I both untap, and I then cast a Sanctum of All. And then I activate Conqueror's Foothold to draw a card and discard a card. At the end of my turn, Manny activates Tazri twice. The first time, Mike has him put a Soul of Innistrad into his hand. The second time, I have him put a Salumgar the Drifting Death into his hand. And then he also activates his Azcanta, putting a Kiora Master of Depths to hand. He then casts a Deadly Rollick to exile Dragonlord Dramoka. Then he untaps for his turn, plays a Temple of the False Gods, casts a Seasons Past, returning 4 cards from his graveyard to his hand. Manny then casts a Final Parting, searching his library for 2 cards, one of which goes to hand, and he puts a Woe Strider into the graveyard. He then attacks Mike for 6, and in his second main phase he casts Thought Vessel. In his untap step, Mike and Manny both untap. Mike plays a Mountain for turn, and passes. In his end step, Manny activates Tasigur 3 times. The first time, I give him a Woe Strider. Mike gives him a Krosan Grip. And then for the third activation, I give him Mirage Mirror. And still in his end step, Mike takes advantage of Manny being mostly tapped out to flash in Bogarden Hellkite, doing 4 damage to Seedborn Muse, killing it, and 1 damage to Manny. In my upkeep, Sanctum of All triggers, letting me put Sanctum of Calm Waters into play from my library, and then, in my pre-combat main phase, the Sanctum of Calm Waters triggers, drawing me 2 and discarding 1. I then also cast a Sanctum of Tranquil Light, and a Boros Signet, and then a Simic Signet. At the end of turn, Manny casts Deadly Rollick again to exile the Bogarden Hellkite, as well as Krosan Grip to destroy my Sanctum of All. On his turn, Manny enchants Journey to Eternity on Tasigur, casts an Eternal Witness, returning Seedborn Muse to his hand, and then casts it. He then moves to combat and attacks Mike for 4 with Tasigur. In his second main phase, he casts Kiora, Master of the Depths, activating her +1 ability to untap a land and a creature. In response, I cast a Generous Gift targeting Seedborn Muse, destroying it and making Manny a 3/3 elephant creature token. He then casts Mirage Mirror and passes. On Mike's turn, he plays a Rootbound Crag and casts Mael from the command zone. On my turn, I draw 2 cards and discard 1 card because of the Sanctum of Calm Waters, and I then play a Skyclave Basilica as my land for turn. I then cast a Ghostly Pilferer and pass. Manny plays a Terramorphic Expanse, cracking it for a swamp, and then casts and activates a Soul of Innistrad to return 3 creatures from his graveyard to his hand. Manny then moves to combat and attacks me for 4 with Tasigur and Mike for 3. Before the damage, Mike decides to block with Mael and uses Skarg the Rage Pits to give her +1/+1 so that she survives through combat. In his second main phase, Manny activates Kiora's +1 ability to untap Tasigur and a land, and then uses the mana to again cast Seedborn Muse. He then activates Mirage Mirror, turning it into a copy of Tasigur. This kills the original Tasigur and flips Journey Eternity into a land, but with the trigger to reanimate Tasigur on the stack, I flash in Containment Priest, exiling him instead. Mike untaps for his turn, as does Manny. Mike then casts Rurik Thar the Unbowed, and at the end of his turn, I activate Conqueror's Foothold to draw a card. At the beginning of my first main phase, I draw 2 and discard 1 thanks to the Sanctum of Calm Waters. And I play a Kazul's Cliffs as my land for turn and cast Abundance, but it gets countered by a Mystic Snake from Manny, who is a little bit wary that I played a card that cares about lands in a deck that doesn't play lands. I take 6 damage from Rurik Thar as I cast it, and then I cast Hannah, Ship's Navigator. At the end of turn, Manny activates as Kanta, putting a Seasons Past into his hand. He also casts Vraska's Contempt, exiling Rurik Thar, taking 6 damage and gaining 2 life. On Manny's turn, he casts Seasons Past, returning 5 cards to his hand. He then plays a High Market, casts a Sword of Feast and Famine, equipping it to his Eternal Witness. Then he casts Hero's Downfall, destroying my Containment Priest. He then moves to combat, attacking me for 8 and Mike for 4. I block and kill the Mystic Snake, and before the damage, Manny casts Deadly Rollick again to exile Ghostly Pilferer. He then untaps all of his lands thanks to the combat damage being done with Sword of Feast and Famine. He then casts Final Parting to put Peregrine Drake into the graveyard. This allows him to reanimate and sacrifice the Peregrine Drake as many times as he wants, making infinite mana. He's then able to cast Tasigur, activating Tasigur's ability to basically draw his entire deck until he's able to find Torment of Hailfire, cast it for 1 billion into the X, winning him the game. Alright, so that was a bit of a weird game, unfortunately. As I'm sure you saw, Will's internet crashed out on him, so we were stuck with 3 players after a couple of turns into the game, which isn't ideal, but it could have been worse. We were still able to have a pretty fun game, a pretty good game. We weren't able to get our Goblin Charbelcher or any of our other win conditions on the board, but we were able to put up a fight and use some of our additional cards to our advantage. The Containment Priest came in pretty handy. Generous Gift was able to save us from another round of Seedborn Muses, but I do think this deck could perform well. We just didn't get to showcase all of its talents this time, but maybe in the future. Otherwise, if you guys have any suggestions for future videos, please let me know. Looking forward to some of the future ones. I think next week's video is actually going to be very good, so stick around for that one. But I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.